Have you ever wondered what would happen if you stopped forcing yourself to speak perfect English and instead trained your mind to feel calm and your mouth to move naturally? When I first started learning English seriously, I believed that improvement came from pressure, from long hours of study, from correcting every mistake immediately, and from comparing myself to people who sounded more confident than I did. I believed that fluency was something you chased, something you had to catch before it escaped. Every time I listened to native speakers, my mind would tighten. Every time I tried to speak, my mouth felt heavy, as if the words were stuck behind a wall of fear. I knew vocabulary, I understood grammar, but when it was time to speak, my mind became loud and my mouth became silent. For a long time, I thought the problem was my English level. Later, I discovered the problem was how I trained my mind and how I treated my mouth. I want to share this story slowly, gently, not as a lesson you must memorize, but as a space you can rest in while listening. You do not need to take notes. You do not need to repeat anything out loud. Just listen and let the rhythm of the language guide you. I grew up believing that learning meant effort, and effort meant struggle. If I was not tired, stressed, or frustrated, I felt like I was not doing enough. This belief followed me into my English learning journey. I would sit down with books and videos telling myself that I needed to push harder. I told my mind to focus more and my mouth to be braver. But the more I pushed, the more resistance I felt. My mind became anxious and my mouth became tense. One day, after another disappointing attempt to speak English confidently, I stopped and asked myself a quiet question. Why does my English sound better in my head than when it comes out of my mouth? That question changed everything for me. I realized that inside my mind there was no fear of judgment. Inside my mind there was no listener waiting to correct me. My thoughts flowed naturally, but the moment I tried to speak, fear interrupted the flow. So instead of training my English harder, I decided to train my mind first. I stopped asking, how can I speak better English? And I started asking, how can I feel calmer while using English? This was not a dramatic change. It did not happen overnight. It began with listening, gentle listening, not listening to understand every word, not listening to analyze grammar, but listening to let English exist around me without pressure. I played English podcasts in the background while doing simple tasks. I listened while walking, while resting, while doing nothing. At first, my mind kept trying to translate. It kept trying to catch every sentence, but I gently reminded myself that I did not need to understand everything. Something interesting happened when I let go of understanding. My mind relaxed, and when my mind relaxed, my mouth slowly followed. Before, when I tried to speak, I was thinking about mistakes before they even happened. My mouth was waiting for permission from my brain. But after weeks of gentle listening, English started to feel familiar, like a sound I had heard many times before. It was no longer a stranger. I began to notice that my mouth moved more easily when I repeated short phrases softly, without an audience, without pressure. I did not practice speaking by standing in front of a mirror or recording myself at first. I practiced speaking by whispering. I practiced by reading simple sentences out loud when no one was listening. I practiced by talking to myself kindly. This is something many people do not talk about. Your mouth needs safety. Just like your mind, your mouth reacts to fear. When your mouth feels watched or judged, it tightens. When it feels safe, it opens. I stopped correcting myself every time I made a mistake. Instead, I focused on finishing my thoughts. I allowed imperfect sentences to exist. I allowed pauses. I allowed silence. I learned that fluency is not speed. Fluency is flow. There were days when I felt no progress at all. There were days when my English sounded broken again, but this time I did not panic. I reminded myself that language is not a straight line. Some days you feel smooth, some days you feel heavy. Both are part of training your mind. One of the most powerful changes I made was changing my inner voice. When I made a mistake before, my mind would say, "You are bad at English." Now it says, "You are learning, and learning is allowed to be slow." This small change softened everything. I also stopped comparing my speaking voice to native speakers. I realized I did not need to sound like them. I needed to sound like myself in English. When I accepted my accent, my mouth relaxed even more. My accent was no longer a problem. It became proof that I was brave enough to use another language. As weeks passed, something surprising happened. I started thinking in English naturally, not because I forced it, but because English had become familiar. My mind no longer treated it as a test. It treated it as a tool. When I spoke, I focused on meaning, not perfection. I spoke slower. I breathed more. I let my mouth finish sentences even when my grammar was not perfect, and people understood me. That moment changed my confidence deeply. I realized then that improving English is not about pushing your limits every day. It is about creating a safe space where your mind and mouth can grow together. If you are listening to this and feeling frustrated with your English, I want you to know something important. Nothing is wrong with you. Your brain is protecting you. Your mouth is waiting for safety. You do not need to fight your fear. You need to calm it. You do not need to force fluency. You need to allow it. After I understood that my mind needed calm before my English could grow, I slowly turned my attention to my mouth, not as something to control, but as something to train with patience and kindness. Before this, I treated speaking like a performance. Every sentence felt like a test, and every word felt like it needed approval before leaving my lips. I did not realize how much tension I was carrying in my jaw, my tongue, and even my breathing. I began to notice that when I felt nervous, my breath became shallow. My sentences rushed forward without rhythm, and sometimes my voice disappeared halfway through a thought. So instead of practicing English speaking, I practiced breathing while English was present. I would inhale slowly, then speak one simple sentence on the exhale. I did not care how it sounded. I only cared that my breath and my voice were connected. This simple change made a quiet difference. My voice became steadier. My mouth stopped feeling like it was fighting my thoughts. English started to move with my breath instead of against it. I also learned that the mouth remembers patterns. Just like muscles in the body, the mouth learns through gentle repetition, not force. I stopped trying to say long, complicated sentences. I returned to simple phrases, phrases I had heard many times while listening. I repeated them softly, sometimes out loud, sometimes only moving my lips. I did this without correcting pronunciation every time. I trusted that clarity would come later. There was a moment when I realized something important. When children learn to speak, they are not corrected every second. They are allowed to sound unclear. They are allowed to try. I decided to give myself the same permission. Instead of practicing English for hours, I practiced for short moments, many times a day. While washing dishes, I described what I was doing in English. While walking, I named things I saw. These were not perfect sentences, but they were real. My mouth learned to move without fear because these moments felt private and safe. I stopped waiting until I felt ready to speak. Readiness, I learned, comes after action, not before. Each small sentence built trust between my mind and my mouth. There were still moments of embarrassment. Sometimes I forgot words, sometimes my grammar fell apart. But instead of freezing, I learned to pause. I learned to breathe. I learned to continue. This was one of the biggest shifts for me. I realized that communication does not require perfection. It requires courage and presence. As I continued this gentle training, my listening also changed. I started noticing how native speakers pause, how their sentences rise and fall, how silence is part of speech. I stopped trying to copy their speed and focused on their rhythm. My mouth followed rhythm more easily than rules. Slowly, my speaking began to sound more natural, not because I memorized patterns, but because my body had absorbed them through listening. English stopped feeling like a foreign structure and started feeling like a flow. One day, I had a conversation that surprised me. I spoke without planning every sentence in advance. Words came out imperfectly, but smoothly. I did not stop to correct myself. I did not apologize for my accent. I simply spoke. When the conversation ended, I realized my hands were not shaking. My chest was calm, my mind was quiet. That was when I understood that confidence is not loud. Confidence is calm. I continued training this way, gently, consistently, without pressure. Some days I spoke more, some days I only listened. I accepted both as progress. I stopped measuring improvement by how fluent I sounded and started measuring it by how safe I felt using English. As my sense of safety grew, my fluency followed naturally. My sentences became longer. My ideas became clearer. My mouth trusted that my mind would support it, and my mind trusted that my mouth would try. This harmony between mind and mouth changed how I saw English forever. It was no longer something I had to conquer. It was something I could live with, slowly, gently, every day. And as this journey continued, I began to understand how consistency, not intensity, shaped my English, and how returning to listening again and again became the foundation of everything I could express. As I kept returning to listening, I began to understand that listening was not a passive activity, but a quiet form of training that shaped both my thoughts and my speech. Every time I listened without pressure, my mind absorbed patterns, expressions, and rhythm naturally. I was no longer chasing English. I was letting English come to me. I noticed that on days when I listened more, speaking felt lighter. On days when I skipped listening, my mouth felt stiff again. This taught me that listening was not preparation for speaking. Listening was speaking practice, just in a different form. I stopped separating skills in my mind. Listening, speaking, thinking, and feeling became part of the same gentle process. When I listened calmly, my thoughts slowed down. When my thoughts slowed down, my mouth had time to follow. There were moments when I felt stuck again. Old fears returned quietly, especially when I spoke to new people. But this time, I did not fight those feelings. I recognized them as signals asking for more gentleness, not more effort. I listened more, I spoke less, and slowly, the fear softened. I learned to trust silence. When I did not know a word, I paused instead of panicking. I learned that pauses do not mean failure. Pauses mean thinking. Native speakers pause too. When I allowed silence, my sentences felt more natural and my confidence stayed intact. One of the most important lessons I learned was that fluency grows when you stop chasing it. The more I tried to sound fluent, the more tense I became. The moment I focused on connection instead of correctness, my English opened up. My accent remained, and I stopped trying to hide it. I realized my accent told a story of effort, curiosity, and courage. People listened to my words, not my mistakes. And when I believed that, my voice grew stronger. Over time, English became part of my daily life, not a special activity I needed to prepare for. I thought in English sometimes. I dreamed in English occasionally. I spoke English without planning. It was not perfect, but it was real. Looking back, I can see that my biggest progress came from moments that looked small. Quiet listening, soft speaking, kind self-talk. These moments did not feel powerful at the time, but together they changed everything. If you are listening now and wondering if this gentle way really works, I want you to know that it does. Not because it is easy, but because it respects how your mind and body learn. Pressure may create short bursts of progress, but gentleness creates lasting fluency. You do not need to rush. You do not need to compare yourself to anyone else. Your English will grow at the pace your mind feels safe to move. This is why returning to listening again and again is so important. Every time you listen, even if it feels repetitive, your brain strengthens familiar pathways. Repetition without pressure builds confidence quietly. So if today feels slow, that is okay. Slow days still train your mind. Quiet days still move you forward. Thank you for spending this time with me. You can return to this episode tomorrow or any day you want and let the words settle deeper each time you listen. Rest your mind, relax your mouth, and trust the process. Keep listening gently, and I will be here with you again very soon.